speaks. Our overall theme for today is popular culture, which is a distinctly non-anthropological concept. And so we're very fortunate having a very distinguished anthropologist here to unpack this in a very specific way, namely with a focus on one particular activity, if you will, that would fall under the rubric of popular culture. But as I say, it is a very shifting rubric. I think one of the main issues here, and we're moving into this in a way which is more powerful than we've done in the past, is looking at Taiwan now in terms of interconnection. We haven't paid as much attention to the interconnectivity of Taiwan, except with reference to the earlier periods when it was run by the Dutch or the Japanese or the Manchus. There the interconnectivity is obvious. But since then, we've been moving away from it. Now we're going smack right into it again. And that theme, although from a political science perspective, will be continued in our last session. Certainly, we all know that Taiwan is part of the globe and part of a larger region on that globe, and we're going to be exploring some aspects of this today and next week. Well, as far as today is concerned, we are most fortunate in having Professor Marc Moskowitz as our lecturer. Professor Moskowitz is in the Department of Anthropology at the University of South Carolina. He has written many distinguished works, and I'm not going to say too much about his books because Professor Rubinstein will be following me. But let me say that one of the things I find most impressive about Professor Moskowitz is how each of his books deals with a fresh subject, really fresh. It's as if he reorients and retools himself and moves from one to the other. And I think that this is a particularly valuable kind of creativity because it really helps expand the dimensions of the field. But having said all this, I will now ask Professor Rubinstein to formally introduce our speaker.
It's my pleasure to talk about Marco. We've known each other a good while now. And, you know, can I say this? I feel very happy I did this. Somewhere along the line, they asked me, I had a long working relationship with the University of South Carolina. I know the golf courses around there very well. But as part of that, I got to know the Asian Studies program, the Dixie Walker program. And they asked me if I would write for Marco, and you contacted me. And I'm happy to say, obviously, I did. I knew you worked very well, and you are there now. So I'm very happy I did that. And I also played another role, I'm happy to say. The University of Hawaii Press asked me to read the Minor Arts of Daily Life, which is an absolutely wonderful book about popular culture in Taiwan. It really has many, many dimensions. And it also introduces us to a lot of scholars we might not have known, and a lot of topics that we don't necessarily think about. And so that book is a wonderful piece of an edited book that shows how important an edited book can bring to light a variety of important topics. And I've also seen Marco's films, particularly the one on Go in China, which I thought was very powerful. You don't get a sense of, we don't sort of think about it. Yes, we know the chess world, Bobby Fischer, etc. But this is that and more in China. And the power of the game and the influence of the game is enormous, and this film gives us a very good sense of that. And the other works, again, are very, very important. The Holy Treatise is exactly that. It's a book looking at a subject you don't think about now, but in many ways, given the battle over abortion in our country, it may well be, should be useful reading for a lot of people. I mean, that battle still rages in a variety of ways. You've seen that. And again, I guess to some extent, Marco and I don't know if we copy each other, but our approach to Taiwan is there's lots of things going on, and we both appreciate doing lots of things. I think in a lot of ways, my stuff is a little more political, if you will, and religious, but your stuff is all over the place, and I love it. Thank you for being here.
I want to thank Professor Cohen and Sir Rubinstein for inviting me here. It's a real privilege to be here. It's my second time. I very much enjoyed it last time. And I'm excited you all came. It's such a gorgeous day outside. I was afraid it'd just be the four of us and we'd end up going for coffee or something. So I appreciate that. When they asked me to talk about the state of popular culture in Taiwan studies, I thought what I would do is connect it to a book I wrote primarily on mainland China. And as Professor Cohen said, talk about the connections there, because I think that's a big part of Taiwan studies. Taiwan is exciting to me, in part because it's Taiwan, but in part because it's such a wonderful mix of Japanese elements and Chinese elements and American elements. And so we'll talk about the ways that this game creates specific cultural venues for China, specific cultural venues for Taiwan, and the shared culture as well. And in the end, there's no such thing as a bad question. So if any of you have questions, do feel free to ask. Basically, what I did was I wrote a book, but at the same time I was filming a documentary. And there were meant to be complementary elements here. Today we'll just talk about the book. But if you have questions about the act of filmmaking as well, we can talk about that a bit later. So Weiqi, known as Go in the US, Ego in Japan, Baruch in Korea, is a point of shared culture and a point of competition. This becomes a very important part of modern politics. For example, when Korea beats Japan at the game of Baruch, it's exciting not just as a competition, but as an anti-colonial revenge, right? When China retakes the game from Japan, which was superior players for a long time, this takes on added significance. When Taiwan players primarily go to Japan, this is such a wonderfully Taiwanese experience of this Japanese relationship and extending to the point that Taiwan's team has been called the second Japanese team in many ways. And this is just changing in the last 10 or 15 years. Before we talk about that stuff, though, I want to talk about games. Because basically my argument is that the game of Go, or Weiqi, is a way of constructing masculinity. And when I first say this, most people kind of scratch their heads and they're too polite to say, what the heck are you talking about? But you know that's what people think. So do games have cultural balances? Do they teach cultural values? Do they reflect cultural values? And I started thinking about the game of Monopoly. Hey, how many people here have played Monopoly? So you're all familiar with the game. We all played as kids, right? What does Monopoly teach a child about society? The underlying values. Money, exactly. It's capitalism. Monopoly is training for capitalism. And so you're learning to be a slumlord or invest in high value real estate. Going to jail is an allegorical constant. You know you will end up in jail at some point in this game. And that's part of the game. Don't think too seriously about it. If we think about our white crime, white-collar crime, that's more or less the message that our government has continued with as well, isn't it? So what do we learn from games? Chess? How many people play chess here? Okay, less, but a few of you. Chess has its own allegories, its own story. So you have pawns, only a pawn in the game, right? The expendable foot laborers, the soldiers. You had knights who leaped over other pieces on the board. You have bishops, which are religious figures that don't have a lot of authority, so they kind of go diagonally. They're not direct. The queen, who pretty much does whatever she pleases. And the king, who is limited by his own power. The king cannot venture too far abroad because when he ends, the game ends. And so it becomes an allegory for feudal Europe, for power structures. If you like Game of Thrones, probably this one will get more hands. How many people like Game of Thrones? Less, actually, than chess. I wouldn't have expected that. Anyway, it's a good for realpolitik. Weiqi has its own metaphors. is how many people play Weiqi? That's the last time I'll pick on you guys. Okay, actually more than chess. That's interesting, unusual. Very good. So divination. A lot of Weiqi players talk about Weiqi is evolving out of divination. And they say that because it's a 1919 board, and it kind of looks like astrology, right? It looks like the stars in the sky. And so they thought, well, maybe the game originated from people trying to figure out the future through the patterns that it made. This argument's a little bit limited because, in fact, when it began, it was a 17 by 17 board. And I forget the exact year. I want to say 300 AD or something. They made it 19 by 9 to make it more like astronomy. So the direction of this, the teleological answers, were part of a reverse course. Divination probably doesn't hold up too well. Taoism, the random structures like yin and yang, the black pieces and the white pieces, and the idea of sometimes the least important things are the most important things. Now traditionally, now in China they count the spaces and the pieces. But traditionally it was the system Japan continues to use, that you count pieces you've taken and the spaces in the board. And I can't think of anything more Taoist than that the spaces are what matter in the game. There's something very mystical about that. Buddhism. For a long time in traditional China, the best players were Buddhists, and specifically Buddhist monks who hung out in monasteries. They literally just played Go all day. And the reason they thought it was a way of cultivating, shoshin, right? Cultivating oneself. And so you cannot be too greedy or you lose the game. If you care too much about winning the game, you'll lose the game. So it was thought that playing this game actually taught religious fundamentals in Buddhism. At the same time, there was a tremendous amount of vocabulary for warfare, invading the enemy, killing groups, things like that. So religious enlightenment and very strong violent imagery went hand in hand. So if we compare the two very quickly, what we see is that chess is I don't want to say easier, but it's easier for computers to handle because although it's seemingly astronomical numbers to calculate, it's doable. And the way computers do it is brute force. They just memorize every single game ever played. And so they do that. This has fundamentally changed the way people play chess. Today, professional chess players to beginners all need computers to train. It's unthinkable to play chess anymore without some connection to the computer world. Not true for Weiqi. Weiqi, they still have not created a program that can beat a professional. They can do it if the professional gives them a couple handicap games or a lot of smaller board. But to date, they haven't been able to do that. And so a lot of Weiqi players talk about this proving superiority of the game. I think they're both wonderful games. So maybe that's a long way to frame it. According to Chinese, and this is, so here we are with shared history, right? According to Chinese mythology, you hear the story in Taiwan just as much as you hear it in Beijing. Emperor Yao created the game of Weiqi to train his son. And some of the stories, his son was unruly, some not very bright, some did not want to inherit the empire. All of the versions basically framed it as teaching children to think, to concentrate, and what we'll see later is to be men, to be aggressive yet not too aggressive. And that comes in later. There's mythology, an act story where a lumberjack or a woodsman's walking down in the woods and he sees two immortals playing the game. And so he sits to watch, and after a while the immortals look up and say, "Oh, you're still here? It's time for you to go." They point to an axe, and the handle is rotted because he's been there for so long. It takes a long time for a wooden handle to rot, right? It's been there so long. So this is kind of our Rip Van Winkle tale, but a parable for Weiqi. Unlike the West with chess, lots of poems, lots of the best poets of Chinese language poets have written poetry about the game. So in China and Taiwan, people talk about it being a 4,000-year-old game, a 3,000-year-old game. The first written records we have were around 548 BC. That's when we know for sure the game existed. And it was referred to in a way that made people think, okay, they were using it, they didn't have to explain what the game was. And basically the Weiqi player picks up the piece but doesn't know where to play. This today is Chengyu for being indecisive, right? And then Confucius talked about it. Interestingly, Confucius wasn't exactly lauding the game in the way it later would be. It's hard to stand someone who stuffs himself with food and drink all day long without applying himself to anything. Are there not players of Bo and Weiqi? Even doing that would be better than doing nothing at all. So he doesn't exactly hold it up as high culture here, does it? He doesn't condemn the game, as many people in the Weiqi sphere think. But he's not exactly lauding the game either. Mencius talked about it as an unfilial act. And so by the time we get to Mencius, it's actively criticized. Now, why would it be unfilial? One is he just spent a lot of time at it. We all know that early Confucianists basically were very dismissive of things that were not productive. But the other is, it was in a series of other categories. Laziness, greed in favoring one's wife and children over one's parents, pursuing sensual pleasures. All of these things disrupt a family as a corporate sphere. If we think of a family as a corporation, and Professor Cohen's work, you talked a bit about this when the wife's independent funds, right? If we think of the family as a corporation, all of these things would undermine that corporation. Gambling would also, for obvious reasons, and it's thought that Weiqi actually was very involved in gambling debts, and I'll conclude the talk talking about gambling in Taiwan. But today you hold a stone like this, and you put it down because it's the easiest way to keep from hiding what you're doing with your fingers so you don't cheat. And so I think, there's no proof of this, but I think that Mencius was talking about Weiqi in the same way someone today might say playing cards or talk about going to Vegas, where the implication of gambling was understood. When you say going to Vegas, everybody knows you're talking about gambling. I saw a modern translation of the Mencius statement, and they just said gambling. They didn't even mention Weiqi. So I think this is not as far out of left field as it may seem. And I'm bragging and arguing. Again, you're undermining the family unit by distributing ideas about the family to people who should know. By the Tang Dynasty, it became the four arts. And so every cultural gentleman, every man who wanted to have respect in the eyes of his community, who was elite, had to play this game. This is absolutely unique. There's no other culture in the world that I could think of that you have to play a game to be considered an honorary member of the elite. Chess had a lot of that, especially in the pre-Fisher years, right? Pre-Bobby Fischer. But it wasn't required. You didn't have to play it. And today, if you go to universities, it's being offered a lot. And I think that's because people are re-embracing this. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, we see Weiqi, Guangdong, is here playing Weiqi as a surgeon removes a poison arrow from his arm. So not just an arrow, but a poison arrow. And to show his rare combination of martial prowess and intellect, he's playing Weiqi as this is all going on. So it becomes an emblem of kind of this weird intellectual machismo. If we look at Japan really took over the game. But in the beginning, it was kind of depicted as a frivolous pastime for women. In these courtesan halls, they're playing Go a lot in the Tale of Genji. Later, they developed four houses, and the government actually sponsored these four houses to compete. And that's when Go really developed to its current state. So people in China and Taiwan have told me that China is Go's parent, Japan is Go's foster parent, that without Japan's influences. And so this is, again, this wonderful connection between Japan, Taiwan, and China. This ended in 1868, and the newspapers started sponsoring this, and we see this even today. So 380 years of unquestioned supremacy. When they would come to Taiwan or go to Beijing to play, they would usually let people take 2 or 3 first moves, and they would still just crush them. And so also legends in Japan, triple ko game. Basically, ko is like being in check, so a 3-way ko game. Very rare, and there was a feudal lord who watched it, and he died later that night. And they said that's because he saw this triple ko. Again, this idea of divination embedded in the game. The Masters of Go, a real-life story of 2 Japanese professionals, and a wonderful tale. The author actually won a Nobel Prize for literature, and it's not necessarily just for this book, of course. It's a wonderful tale of old ways of doing things and new. So in the old way, it was about prestige and doing things aesthetically, and the younger guy just wanted to win at all costs. He didn't care what he had to do. And so this becomes a parable for changing society. The atomic bomb game, they were in Hiroshima playing, and this very rude policeman said, "Don't you know there's a war going on? Get out of here." And so they went into the mountains. Hiroshima was bombed by the Americans, and the windows blew in as they were playing the game. The board thrown to the ground. They got up. They didn't know what atomic power was at that point. Put the game back together from memory. Again, 19 by 19 board, right? It's pretty impressive. And people do this. I said, my classmates, my 10-year-old classmates, they do this. Amazing piece of memory. Japan, you know this? Okay, I'm seeing some people spot. Exactly. Hikaru no Go is the reason most people in Taiwan that I've talked to play the game. Most people in America play it because of this as well. It's a manga and anime done in Japan. I read the whole series when I was in Taiwan, and the Chinese translation and complex characters. It's about that thick. There are 20 volumes. What's interesting to me about this is, unlike things of my generation, Speed Racer, you guys probably wouldn't know that. But basically, Speed Racer was a Japanese cartoon, and it was just the love of racing and cars. But you never learn how to race a car. You never learn how to fix a car. With this, after the first 4 or 5 episodes, you had to play the game to get the narrative. It wasn't exciting unless you knew how to play. And notice the animation here, the action-packed adventure, the power coming from this. But he's actually telling him where to go here. This becomes part of the drama. And so they're watching this on TV, and the teacher's saying, "Oh, I can't believe he played in that corner. Why is he doing? What is he thinking?" And so the drama is around the actual way the game is being played, the actual moves that are being played. Again, tremendous influence in Taiwan. Go Seigan, very interesting character. Born in mainland China, moved to Japan when he was 7, I think. He was offered Taiwanese citizenship and went to Taiwan to receive this honor from Shanghai Shek, but he had just lost a competition with China. Not with China, I'm sorry, with Japan. And Shanghai Shek said, he didn't say it to his face, but he said of him, "We don't need losers here." And so they decided not to offer him citizenship. He transformed the game. Before him, it was thought that you start from the outside and you work your way in the middle. And he started in the very center and worked his way out. It was thought to be an insult when he first played it. They thought, "You're not taking me seriously." He's interesting because of this Taiwan connection, because China, because he lived in Japan. Is he Japanese? I don't know. Is he Chinese? I don't know. Is he Taiwanese? I don't know. So he's a wonderful emblem for the way these borders are very amorphous, that they're very artificially constructed. Other people who study Japan range from people from Korea to Taiwan to the United States. Japan continues, even today, to be the real mecca, training ground, unless you're from China or Korea now. Some people are starting to do their own. Most Taiwanese are still going to Japan. Not all. We'll talk about that in a minute. Ye Weiping from China didn't transform the way of playing, but he was the first person to really consistently beat the Japanese. And again, this retaking of a Chinese tradition against Japan takes on these significances. When Taiwan beats Japan, it's a very different kind of message because of the different view of Japanese playing. And then we have Korean players. Liu Chung-ho made it a much more aggressive game. And I think today, Korea is probably number one, although most people from China would say no, we're number one. So we talked about Weiqi in the women's sphere as a frivolous pastime. When I was in Beijing, I interviewed somebody who was a Tudong professional. She was also a Beida student. She was the first national team member. And I said, so why did they suddenly, in the year 2000, so late, well, why then? And she said, well, it's because Korea had a women's team, so China needed a women's team as well. Interestingly, she's the most famous, as most of the female players are, for playing mixed doubles. So they treat it as a sport. China is conceived of as a sport. And so they have one male and one female player. And Taiwan, on the other hand, has some amazing female players. And I think this is the 2010 Asian Games. They decided to treat it as a sport for that one time. And if we look, Korea just dominated. China second, not surprising. Men's team, Japan, mixed pair, Korea, Taiwan. The women, I think, today, when we think of female players, we think of Taiwanese players. And so that's kind of a unique place to be in this world, especially when we think about the stereotypes of the South or Taiwan as being feminine, as opposed to the masculinized North. The ways that this reinforces that. We have two main players that I think are fairly famous. Min is won every competition there is to win, often simultaneously. I think at one point she had seven titles of the different competitions simultaneously. Really amazing, amazing player. And then, how many people know her? How many people know Joe Missing? Really? No? Okay. I'm showing my age. She's in the Weiqi world, she's a superstar. And unlike Min, who's a superstar purely because of talent, Missing's kind of the sex symbol of the Weiqi world. A lot of people download her pictures, they have posters of her. And she's used this to her credit. I mean, she's an amazing player, don't get me wrong, but she's used this to her credit to protest discrimination. All this attention she's getting for her physical attraction, she's used as a way of getting the mainstream press to pay attention to the fact that women aren't paid as much, that they're not getting the same prestige. Yeah, you had it.
What's her ethnicity?
Missingham. She's half Australian. Her father's Australian. But she grew up, I think she moved to Taiwan, she was around 4 years old.
Her mother's Taiwanese.
Mother is Taiwanese. And she was one of the few players who didn't go to Japan to train. So she's very unique in a lot of ways. And she gets discounted because of the sex symbol status. She's actually a pretty amazing player. First, if you want to count her as Australian, she's the first Australian to become a professional. So very impressive in these ways. Again, this gender dynamic is an interesting thing. And I think today, most people, when they talk in the Weiqi sphere, when they talk about Go or Weiqi, they talk about Taiwan's women's team. Back to masculinity, how do men show off status? How do people flaunt their prestige? And I think almost all of the ways, and this is true in Taiwan as well, they're very Western coded, right? The sports suit, the red wine, playing piano or tennis. These things are very much Western based. So if we look at Weiqi in Taiwan, for example, and we could say, okay, here's something that's not Western. It's traditionally Chinese. It's very much Taiwanese. And it's a different kind of symbolic capital. It's still very much embedded in elite discourse. But it's a different kind of elite discourse. And I think that's one of the significance. That's why the game is actually becoming more popular, not less popular. Other forms of masculinity, if we look at studies of masculinity, almost always about kind of this Chinese-style machismo, right? Men being men. Paul Fessa does some wonderful work with this guy, going out and being rugged men. Womenizing. Or sexual choices. So gay lifestyles is the other thing that a lot of studies are looking at. So machismo, womenizing, using women as conspicuous consumption, and alternative identities in the mainstream discourse, and the ways those play with heteronormative expectations in Chinese society. So here we have Go, that is, again, a very different kind of masculinity. Other forms might be fatherhood, being a good husband, being a good devoted child, being a religious person. These things, I think, are not being framed as masculine issues in our current studies. So when we're talking about popular culture and things to do in Taiwan studies, I think one thing we could do is revisit some of these things, like religion, fatherhood, and revisit them not only as Taiwanese events, but particularly as a popular culture that is very gender-coded. Ways of looking at this as a specifically gender nuance, which I think gets overlooked a lot. So I studied in 3 different venues in China, and then interviewed some people in Taiwan. The first was this Weiqi school, and these kids just crushed me. And to be fair, they could crush 99% of Chinese as well. They were very, very good. And at first, I went in feeling bad, but I tell you, after 3 days of them taunting me, I was like, I'm going to crush this kid. I'm going to see what I can do. You know, they were terrific to work with. And I think one of the things they're doing is they're being trained for suture. This idea of quality that emerges out of the eugenicist discourse of the 1900s, maybe late 1800s. And this becomes an obsession. In Taiwan, I don't hear suture as often, but I hear modernization, for example. These other code words that are essentially the same thing. So training children, we saw that the emperor used the game to train their children. Not only in the game, but in behavior, sitting still, being polite. These kids hadn't mastered it. They were mean, vicious little people to me, and to each other. No, they were great kids. One of the things I noticed about them, though, is in the West, there's kind of a stereotype about game players as nerdy, out of touch. A lot of this points to American mistrust of intellectualism, I think. We see this in our politics now, this anti-intellectual strain. In Taiwan, of course, this isn't true. The same characteristics, loving your mother, being obedient, studying hard, are ideals for the perfect man. And so they were training these boys, they had none of the stigma that they might have had in the West. It's a very different way of viewing these things. The walls, full of things about disciplining the children, proper behavior, mannerism, speech. So this overall spectrum of training a young child to be the proper man, of treating mannerisms. This is straight from Japan, actually, but they're teaching it to these Chinese kids as a non-Japanese experience. The idea of bowing to one's opponent. Very, very, very much a Japanese import. Talking about gentlemen as being a very prevalent part of the discourse, and begins in manners and ends in manners. This is a child of someone I interviewed, and he sent me the book, and the child liked the pictures. These are the pictures I just showed you. He's already learning to play the game, so you get a sense of how early this training, this disciplinary structure, training children to sit still for hours at a time. comes into play. Competition's getting a rank, so everyone is absolutely aware of other people's hierarchy, their place in that hierarchy. Very Confucian, again, when you think of that. Now, university clubs, it became an emblem for the tremendous amount of competition. Really, there's a few people a year who can become professionals and make, the people who can make a living from it, probably less than that, right? And so people at universities, some of the most competitive universities, I did my primary research at Baruch, but at Taipei, talking to people as well. Go was thought to be the harder alternative to going to Taipei or Columbia. The chances of getting into Columbia or Taipei are far easier than becoming a professional player. So it became a metaphor for the struggles of everyday life. Was that Annie? Oh, I'm sorry, I do that to people all the time. That's not you. I do that. People scratch and I leave. That's my fault. These two had both been professional members and decided to go to Baruch. Again, they just decided Weiqi was too competitive. Now, Weiqi becomes a metaphor in Taiwan as well as a fear of the future, of class consciousness and relentless competition, of the endurance it takes to survive. And I remember years ago, about a decade ago, if an American student would come to me and they were stressed about the future, I had a very pat speech I would give them. And I'd say, look, you're young enough, you can make mistakes for the next 10 years, still change your mind, you're going to be fine. They'd breathe a sigh of relief and they'd walk out the door. And I said this to someone in Taiwan, and I said, you know nothing. You know, I mean, the level of competition in Taiwan. And I think now, and the reason I preface this as being 10 years ago, I think now you guys are, Americans are also facing this, right? The level of competition is much higher. So they take this board game as a metaphor for these guys. See, you all look depressed now. I just depressed the entire room. As a metaphor for this competition. In that way, Suzhou, these discourses of equality, modernization, becoming a gentleman, become a form of neoliberalism. They're training people for the workforce. They're training you to endure more than you could otherwise endure. And Agnos, of course, has talked about neoliberalism and Suzhou, that this connection of these, Andrew Kipnis is warned against this. He's talked about the ways that you cannot treat neoliberalism of the Reagan era as the same as the neoliberalism of Denmark or Sweden. It's a very different set of actions. But I think the basic premise that these trainings are cultural ways of teaching values that will help them in the workforce and become members, producing members of a new economy, I think are very valid. And this is where it comes into Taiwan as well. That I think when you get to your age, very few people play. Everybody's too busy until they hit about retirement. But as children, more and more parents are enrolling their children in Weiqi schools to give them this training, not only in mathematics, but in disciplining them in the hopes that it will make them more competitive in later life. I also looked at working class players in the park, and this was, to me, the most surprising, because my context was Taiwan. Taiwan, you don't see that too much. You see a lot of Chinese chess, but not Weiqi. It's a very elite game. In the same way that pre-Bobby Fischer, does everybody know Bobby Fischer? We're in New York, so I hope, no? Basically, Bobby Fischer was this mad genius from the working class. And when he started winning competitions against Russia, who had dominated the sphere, suddenly Americans of all classes started playing with the parts. And you see people from the elite, but also very poor. Never happened in Taiwan. Taiwan's never had that working class guy to make it famous for Weiqi. Why China? And the reason, I think, is because of this very different set of experiences in history. China and Taiwan share the elite history. They share the times when elite players would go spend a day and play in the woods, but only a few people could afford this. I love this painting. It's actually the same painting. This little circle here is this. So you get a sense, again, back to this Taoist idea of being immersed in nature is a big part of that. Now, if we look at working class parts in China, it's because basically in China, if you could afford air conditioning, you go for air conditioning. So the people out here, they were out there when it was unbelievably hot. You just couldn't believe it. And then also unbelievably cold. They were there from morning till it got dark. When they were so hot, they were sweating, to when there was literally snow on the streets. And I went there, I'd wear 2 jackets and gloves and a hat, and I was still, you're sitting on this cold concrete. I couldn't do it. It was just an amazing endurance test. So why is that? What's going on here? I think what's happening is because of the Cultural Revolution. And that's counterintuitive in so many ways, because the Cultural Revolution is very anti-elite culture. If they were going to wipe anything out, you'd think it'd be Weiqi, right? But in fact, people got sent, the sent out youth got sent, and they had nothing to do. So they just played Weiqi all day long. And so the guy I showed you, King, who was the first to really defeat Japan, he learned in a camp. He was a sent down youth, and he learned to play here. And the other side of that is these park players were not necessarily working class because they chose to be working class. A lot of them were working class because they were told, you're a construction worker now. So playing Go was a way to reclaim their intellect, the public acknowledgement of their intellect. And it was an evening mechanism, a mechanism that made them even. It became a metaphor for modernization and tradition at the same moments. That all this Confucian imagery of the traditional age became embedded in this, but yet very modern. We play online now. So I play online almost every day, very quick games. And many people do, and so that's a different kind of structuring of the game. In this influence, I think, tales of culture and ways of dealing with cultural motifs. So one of the, for me, the hardest thing to get used to is kibitzing. Do people know what kibitzing means? Kibitzing, oh yeah, okay, of course. It's basically when you tell people, you should make this move, you should make that move. And as a chess, I learned to play chess before I could remember learning to play chess. I don't remember learning it because I was so young. It's such a forbidden thing to tell someone else where to move. Also in Weiqi, in the higher Taiwan, you would never do this. Because again, it's embedded in elite culture, and suture, proper behavior, mannerisms. These guys, it was a team sport. If you weren't in there yelling, go here, you weren't a good friend. It just wasn't part of that. And when I first went, I couldn't do it. People tell me where to move, and I say, oh man, you're right, I would win if I only made that move. But I can't do it. And they laughed, and the guy next to me said, well, he's a professor, that's why. And that's because they saw professors have suture, right? They thought that it was laughable, though. They inverted this power structure, and it's the weapon of the weak, James Scott's weapon of the weak. And this idea of these values being silly, unnecessary, unwelcome, as pretentious even. And I think the other thing I recognized when I first started studying this was that these gentlemen had not had training like the kids in my school, who were all kind of affluent kids. They couldn't afford that training when they were kids. It didn't exist, really. They had pirated copies of Japanese books, maybe, at best. So this also became a way of turning it back into that Japanese forced school things, where it became a whole teamwork, a team effort. They were remarkably good, much better than I ever be. I'm a decent player, but I'll never get to their level. Because they had, for 10 solid years, 20 solid years, every single day gone to this park and trained, and as a group figured out what was the best move, as a group. And so this, I think, is in contradiction with this other neoliberalist discourse where they're training individuals to compete, defeat all others. And it's a very different ethos. Not that that ethos was free here as well, because it became a way of showing individual prowess, of showing Wen and Wu, this idea of the Confucian gentleman, the elite, the very scholarly Wu, the marshal. Kang Lui, many of you probably know his book on gender. He talks about how in today's society we've been influenced by Western interpretations of masculinity, and that there's a prioritizing of this Wu, this masculine identity. But in traditional China, it was very much the opposite, that the ideal man was kind of effeminate by today's standards. And I wrote a book on pop music where I made an argument that pop music is a perfect manifestation, and looked at the ways that Taiwanese pop music is influencing mainland China, not only musically, but poetically, lyrically, and in gender construction as well, because it was inversing this northern, very rugged masculinity that you say is the Beijing, where the voices are very deep and people's behavior is very much more rugged. And the ideal man is being kind of this very effeminate, lovable, feminine. You could hug him and be his best friend and sleep with him too, kind of thing. It's this wonderful combination. I think though, Weiqi shows us that it's not always either or. That you could, so back to this Guanggong picture, that you can be both Wen and Wu in the same moment in the Weiqi sphere. And that puts Weiqi in a fairly unique place. If you're using Kung Fu, that's very much embedded in the Wu, not the Wen. If you're learning calligraphy, very much embedded in the Wen, but not the Wu. But Weiqi is both, because again, you've got this vocabulary of invading battlefronts, killing the enemy, invading territories. And then there's something seizing the initiative, Shinsho, or Sente in Japanese. And this is a very important strategy. Almost all Weiqi players, except maybe Japanese players, have a different ethos. But most Chinese, Taiwanese, and Korean say you're more likely to win if you can control the other person's movements, if you could make them respond to you. And this became a form of dominance, I think. I was sitting and I was playing, and this guy out of nowhere kind of criticized me as being too Wenro, too tender in my playing style. I didn't know you could use Wenro in that way. I didn't know you could have a Wenro playing style, and I'd never heard it negatively that way. And so I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, here's where you should have gone. You should seize the initiative. You should push. And so the next game, I was all fired up. I'm like, oh, I'll show him who's Wenro. And so I'm playing him, and I'm just pushing him. And this guy beside me said, oh, he's controlling you. He's got you. You have to respond to him. And I still lost the game. But they didn't care, because it didn't matter if you won. What mattered was you controlled. And you might crash and burn in horrible destruction, or you might emerge victorious in this wonderful celebration with a much better dramatic games. And this is very different from the college, the university students who play, who said, if you win by 1 point, that's a win. That's what you should go for. So it wasn't just about winning and losing, it was about showing these flashes of brilliance and dominating. And that's part of working class culture, I would argue. That I grew up in kind of a working class area in the US, and a big part of that is showing who's kind of tougher. We hit each other as a game. Taiwan, very much the same. When we think about the Taiwanese class issues of behavior and modeling and what's appropriate behavior for a man, I think we see a very similar thing to the US, in spite of this being such a different culture, right? The working class being much more rugged with the betel nut and the cigarettes and the elite at the university being much more soft-spoken, much more careful, introspective, less likely to overtly show hostility. And so this seizing the initiative became a test of manhood, a way of showing one's ability not to be dominated and to be able to dominate others.
Mark,
Yeah.
there's a game Words with Friends. And that now increasingly has become defensive.
I don't know what that is. What
It's
is
the equivalent of Scrabble online.
Okay.
And, you know, my life is enough for a lot of people are, but the net game used to be very aggressive. And now
Interesting.
the better players are defensive, right? And that,
Well, and we saw this also in chess. That one of Bobby Fischer's things was he made it a very careful pawn game. And as opposed to people like Kasparov who came after the style before, where it was much more about these wild battles and no one could read. And he was very methodical, one step at a time. So yeah, these things shift over years, and not only on the board, but part of our culture, right? I think you could argue that American culture is also accepting a wider range of male performance, and even in the heterosexual domain. That being a nerdy, effeminate, I was born 20 years too early. I would have loved your generation. It's okay to be nerdy now. It's okay to be not a football player now, in ways that it wasn't before.
Some of the richest men in this country are nerds.
Yeah, no, exactly. The computer industry has changed the way we see the world. It's changed what we think of as successful. And of course, you know, in the 50s with the war and the industry playing such a large role, that influenced the ways that men took on masculinity, I think. So this all is kind of contagious to a larger perspective of national identity as a whole. I mentioned that Taiwan, many people treat it as Japan's second team. So Taiwan style is probably a mix of Chinese and Japanese style, but I think it's still much more influenced by Japanese style. And so it's thought that Japanese players don't win anymore because they're too passive, they're too concerned with tradition, they're more concerned with artistic expression than they are with winning or losing. There are actually practical reasons for this. Japanese competitions pay more, and they're longer games. So Japanese players train for a different kind of game. Korean and Chinese games are shorter, and so you have to just throw stuff in much quicker. You can't always sync it out the same way, which means Japanese do better in Japanese competitions, but not as good in the international competitions. But as an anthropologist, what's interesting to me is that this all bleeds into a perception of Japanese men as a category. That the men are passive, that the men are concerned with tradition, that the men are more concerned with artistic expression than winning. And in talking to people about these stereotypes of what is a Japanese guy like, what's a Korean guy like, it was startling how much the Weichi stereotypes overlapped with other stereotypes. When they talked about Korean players, they said aggressive, they'll do anything to win. There was a lot of anger about claiming Chinese traditions as their own, ranging from Confucius to Weichi to chopstick use, apparently. And I've talked to a lot of people with Korean, and you know, half of them say, "Oh, that's not true," and half of them say, "Well, yeah, because you know the borders of China and Korea shifted. That's why." So Confucius was Korean. And that's what's going on. That's where these are coming from. But there's a tremendous idea that the Koreans are the young upstarts in the Weichi world. How dare they be the winners? But also economically. If we look at Korea's power in the economic voice, their amazing power of popular culture right now. I would argue that you cannot understand Taiwanese popular culture without understanding Korean pop culture. And that's a new thing. Before
Does the
that,
reverse also apply? Does the reverse?
no, I don't think it does. I think that Koreans are familiar with Chinese language, pop music, for example, and movies. But I think it hasn't had the same influence. The same as like in the 90s, it was Japan. Japan had a tremendous influence on Taiwan. And through Taiwan, China, in pop music, soap operas, things like that. But I'm not sure it went the other direction so much. It was kind of a one-way flow. Now it's all in dialogue, of course. Arguably, the Korean soap operas are popular because they borrow on older models of Japanese. Again, these what Americans might call effeminate men being sensitive, right? but centering these dramas around family. And so making it more culturally proximate, not so foreign as a lot of American dramas were perceived to be. So what was interesting to me too about this is when I talked to people, not so much Taiwan. I think Taiwan people talked about Koreans as being abusive in relationships physically. So that tied into this thing. But in China they talk about them being terrible drivers. And how can you tell? You know, everyone is like South Carolina. Everyone's kind of driving very creatively. These pictures are all Japanese, actually. So even this, I've appropriated Japanese imagery for a Korean stereotype. And that's exactly my point, that this is all created. This is all culturally created. Now there's some very controlled Korean players. People who are not at all aggressive players. But this stereotype persists. Every time I give this talk, I'll have a Korean or a Chinese person say, no, that's not true. And I say, yes, exactly, it's not true. So the point isn't what are Koreans really aggressive or are they not. The point is, why is this such a consistent theme in Chinese imaginary? And I think in Taiwanese imaginary as well. I've been hearing this stereotype for years before I got interested in the Weiqi stuff. Great movies too, Korea. Great movies. And then the Chinese players were the perfect blend of the two, trying to co-opt aggression and restraint. And I think Taiwanese players are shooting for this goal as well. They're trying to appropriate Japanese standards, appropriate Korea, whatever works, basically. So again, less the old Japanese style of trying to show respect is how do we win this? A very utilitarian view of the game and of society as a whole. And tying back into this new liberalist idea, how do you succeed? Maybe it's not with these old models anymore, but the new. Now, I end my book, the conclusion of my book, is with a story of a Taiwanese government official I interviewed. And he was such an interesting guy. His best friend from childhood was a professional Weiqi player. He became a Weiqi player, but he knew him from childhood. And he was from the East Coast, very poor area. And so it wasn't the kind of kids you'd expect to be able to play Weiqi well, especially in his age group. And they would play Waishangren, these guys who had come from mainland China, school teachers, and they gambled them weeks of their salary. And they were con artists, basically. They were pool sharks. Not a game of luck, a game of skill, but these guys would say, oh, you're from the East Coast, you're just a child, of course I'll crush you. And the owner of the Weiqi club would sponsor these guys to play. So he'd take the majority of the winning, but he'd give them. And this guy told me about cheating, and he was very proud of, oh, you just push a piece over like that, and you played really, he was telling me all this stuff that I thought, wow, I didn't expect that. But here's where I was surprised, is so much of my book, so much of my conceptualization of this were the pressures of Weiqi, the ways that Weiqi push kids harder than they should be pushed, discipline them in ways that should maybe wasn't healthy to some degree. And he told me a different tale. He told me of his passion being Weiqi and going home as a child with a Weiqi competition trophy and his father saying, great, I'll hang it up above the toilet. He was so dismissive of his child's desire to become a professional player, and he just humiliated, and eventually the guy I interviewed gave it up. And to me, that's a really important, this is why I ended the book with this tale. It's an important reminder that you are disciplined no matter what venue you take, no matter what direction you go. His discipline was doing exactly what his parents wanted him to do. He became a politician. Right? What more prestigious job could he have gotten in his age group? And meanwhile, his friend went on to be a professional player. So he always regretted not following his heart with this. And so this becomes another form of discipline, the ways we're all trained to do things we're expected. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you very much for your very fascinating talk. But I'd like to, in a sense, focus a bit more on Taiwan for a moment.
Yeah, please, please.
And you just mentioned Weiqi Club, which I found interesting.
Yeah.
My question is that, in fact, in some of your other writings, you focused on, in terms of music, like
Yeah.
Mando pop and so on, you focused on music either coming from Taiwan or coming from Taiwan, coming from Japan, but still via Taiwan.
Yeah,
Having an enormous impact on Chinese popular culture.
absolutely.
And but this talk today, that's not the direction I hear
Yeah.
at all. It seems to me, and this is where I want to get in, that in terms of Chinese popular culture or simply Chinese culture, I mean mainland Chinese culture, Weiqi maybe have a stronger position than in Taiwan.
I think so.
Well, if that's true, can you say the significance of us as a Taiwan seminar,
Yeah.
how that facilitates our understanding of the Taiwan
Good.
scene?
Good.
So I want to pull that
I
out.
think it's especially true, powerful if you're interested in political science. Kissinger actually wrote a book on China, where he stole a couple of other people's ideas, and the way that Weiqi is thought to shape people's perception of political science, and surrounding rather than taking, for example. And where it comes into play for Taiwan is I think Taiwan's still this mediator between China and Japan, even amidst all this change. Now, in the pop music book, I argue that Taiwan became the creator of its own forms. And I think in religion we see this too, that Taiwan is a creator and China is a consumer. If we look at speech patterns, food, fashion, all this are the ways that Taiwan shapes China. But I think in the past I also perhaps erred a little bit, because how do we really talk about Chinese on the global political economy without talking about Chinese influences? And the ways that this is adapted and mediated through Japan, as it always is. All right, I'll tell this. I hope I don't get in trouble for this. I was also running a Taiwan conference with TECO on the. Is there a TECO representative? There is. Next week? No. Yes. Good. Okay, so I can say it, even though I'm being filmed. I'm being filmed. But it's fair enough. I had arranged a conference on Japanese influences on Taiwan, and when the KMT won, they said, "God, we can't do that." So we had to change the conference. And I thought this was so telling. The idea of what is Taiwan and what is our history and what do we want to present ourselves as being for the future. I think Weiqi is a way of perhaps very much in aligned with the KMT's re-embracing of a Chinese identity. And as someone who kind of came of age in the DPP age, I find that surprising, but it's an important part of Taiwan's current struggle for cultural meaning. Who are we as a nation? Who do we want to be in the future? And I think Weiqi becomes a sign of this, both in its trying to compete nationally, but to some degree, the countries that are winning are not always the most affluent countries. To some degree, Taiwan's efforts in the Weiqi sphere are limited because there aren't enough poor, desperate people who are hungry for it. Now people, computer science is an easier route. So basically, I think, I'm glad you brought this up, Myron, because I think for many years I wrote, let's start with Taiwan and enter out, but recently I'm becoming more and more influences with the ways that Taiwan consumes things Chinese. Right now I'm looking at a YouTube project, so I'm looking at YouTube videos in Tudor and these kinds of things. And there was this wonderful interaction with the Cohen. Do you know Cohen O'Brien show? There was a wonderful interaction with Next Media, which is based in Taiwan, and the Conan show. Conan show had developed a fake Taiwanese news animation. With the Taiwanese voice and the 3D animation. Have you seen this in the news?
Yes.
Some of you have. Some of you have. And 2 days later, Next Animation did another one, and they accused Conan of hanging out with Michael Jackson at the Neverland Ranch and of exploiting Chinese labor. And the way this becomes a dialogue between cultures, between Taiwan and the U.S., not only with media, but with ways of looking at who is center and who's peripheral. And I think now China, what is it, 1 million Taiwanese living in China permanently? 1.5 now. Half of them in Shanghai, I assume? Okay, and then we have, I forget, you guys probably know better than I do. What is the percentage of children that are born to non-Taiwanese mothers?
A lot.
It's phenomenal.
It's a NATO 25%.
Yeah, it's phenomenal, right?
Immigration primarily from Indonesia.
Right. Now, this is all a very circuitous route. I am coming to this question. I think we fail ourselves if we study Taiwan as purely Taiwan. I think if we want to be read by anyone outside of Taiwan studies, we have to do these connections with China, for better or worse. And our focus on what that means and the significance of that may shift. But I think Taiwan's place, especially in popular culture, the exciting part is exactly this mix of, as I said in the very beginning of the talk, the Chinese elements and the Japanese elements and the American elements. So it's there. It's a fair question. But, yeah. Other?
Hey, you might take questions yourself.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
A couple
Yeah.
more. The Korean thing, I mean, this is very, off the top of my head, but I think Korea was so much the victim for either China or Japan,
Yeah.
that this aggressiveness, now that they have this growing economy, they're producing more, it is reflected in a lot of ways. This is maybe part of that whole process.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that a big part of a perception that an unempowered group are aggressive are the idea that they're taking what used to be a member of the elites. That's true of class discourse in the U.S. That's true of our contemporary discussions of African American place in American society. Now, there are, if you watch Korean movies, there is something more, they're much more likely to police hit each other, to discipline, right? There is something more physical in the culture. But I think what China and Taiwan are labeling as aggressive, in many ways, is saying unwillingness to be subservient anymore. Very astutely put.
Yeah, I jumped in here because it occurs to me that an important part of East Asian culture, which I include Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, China, and Vietnam, each of these places has their own version of national humiliation. Every one of them.
Sure.
And in every one of them, national humiliation is a big historical force, although it plays out very, very differently. We're talking about different national humiliations at different points. Certainly, it would apply to China starting from the opening war. It would apply to Taiwan starting from the Dutch. I don't know when, but it's not so much a matter of getting even, but it's a matter of reassertion, which occurs in different versions. It's always this kind of national humiliation is happening.
Yes, and then this reassertion, I think, does tie in with getting even, though, right? The Korean team beats a Japanese team. Man, that feels good on several levels, right? In the same way that when a Taiwanese team beats a mainland team, there's more than just a game going on here. It's a national struggle to say who is the dominant one. So this issue of seizing the initiative, this individual player style, becomes a larger political symbology that's involved here.
I would say that the Taiwan is part of the national relations is insignificant.
Yeah, Yeah, and being conflated with China, which I think is always a perilous tightrope that we walk. Absolutely. Yeah.
I have a sort of conceptual question, and
Good.
it applies to both Taiwan and China. So I think follow upon Professor Cohen's question, how do you apply this to Taiwan, right? And I'm thinking another kind of question. So basically what I'm hearing here is that you see Go, Wei Qi as a game for cultivating a particular kind of characteristic of Chinese kids, right? And that's one thing. And another thing that you addressed in your talk is how that actually is a very important part of masculinity, right? So my question for the Taiwan part is that since Wei Qi, well, I don't know, I'm going to open this up so you could answer it. What will be the equivalent of Wei Qi in contemporary Taiwan that parents are so using it to cultivate a particular kind of characteristics for the kids, and what would be the equivalent of Wei Qi to represent, say, masculinity in Taiwan, right? So that's part of it. And the China part is that I'm actually very interested that among many things that I believe that Wei Qi is not the only thing that Chinese parents are using to cultivate a better sort of next generation. Neither is Wei Qi the only means for the expression of masculinity in China, right? So among all the possibilities that one could have choose to study these issues, why Wei Qi then became such a prominent and important part for you?
Both excellent questions. I think the equivalent in Taiwan would be Wei Qi still. You don't see it in the parks, but certainly for children, it's still a big part of a certain subset. Not to imply that everyone's learning Wei Qi, far from it. But it's a certain subset that I think has remarkably similar goals. And that's why I thought it would still work for this Taiwan course, that the idea of constructing masculinity that can dominate, not dominate, that sits still, learns mathematics, that use intellect as a way of defining masculinity. So except for the park thing, to me the park players, the working class players, were really the difference between China and Taiwan in the Wei Qi sphere. Besides that, I think everything I said about my study in Beijing, it very much applies to the Taiwan context. Now, why Wei Qi? I think I was interested in doing it because no one had done it. That there were a few historians that were writing on Wei Qi. No anthropologists had done it in any of these countries, Japan, China, or Taiwan. And I thought that this would be a good way, as an anthropologist does, to explore a new sphere that I haven't looked at. My first book on abortion goes. To be honest, the first reason I did that was like, I know nothing about this, and no one's writing on it. And so with Wei Qi, it was the same thing, that the people who were writing about it, I think, were perpetuating myths about the 3,000-year legacy and this and that, and they weren't investigating it as a cultural context. So for me, the reason this becomes an interesting place is just, it was so unexplored in anthropology. Now, could I have done masculinity in soccer, masculinity in wushu? Absolutely. And all of these would have produced different results. So I'm hoping this will be part of a larger dialogue about popular culture and gender studies that connect to these other parts. But as with any anthropologist, at the end of the day, I have to limit it to some finite group because the other way is madness, basically. But all very good points. Yeah?
I'm going to throw something at a couple things. At one point, baseball was a very big thing.
Yeah.
And, their role in Taiwan, their role in Little League, Little League World Series, et cetera. I don't know if it's still the case, but I mean, they made the Marc, and a fair number of Taiwanese ball players ended up in the major league.
Yeah.
So I think that was one part of it that was totally in it. Another kind of point, I know this is weird, but in a certain way, Wei Chi is safe. And I'm saying that given what I read in the Times, I believe it was yesterday, the Chinese attack on golf. Because, I don't know if you picked up that
No, I
article, but they went through this, still don't
Because of corruption, is that what?
It is looked upon as dangerous, it's, in a lot of ways. Part of it is Western, it's taken
Yeah.
over,
Yeah.
but it's also the corruption, and they go heavy, and the reality, but it's also regional. Most of the golf courses are down south where you play all year round. And, you know, that's what, that is very, very Western, that you do business on a golf course. And now they're attacking that.
Well, I haven't read this, but I'm guessing this goes hand in hand with the anti-corruption campaign.
That's part of it, right.
So it's not just Western, in part there are these other things, but the Western becomes a symbol of decadence. And so I think that's a very powerful set of images. And yes, Wei Chi is a wonderful way to celebrate Chinese history, Chinese or Taiwanese, but it gets labeled as Chinese, right? Baseball is a wonderful counterpoint because baseball is so wonderfully physical. And also baseball is so wonderfully foreign, but what do we mean by foreign in that context? Japanese, exactly. So it's American, but it's really the objections to baseball in Taiwan were because it was so Japanese influence. And when the KMT came, that was their big worry, of course. My goodness, how Japanese everything looks. And then the other factor, I think, is class. I think in Taiwan, when we look at Wei Chi, it's very embedded in middle class to very affluent groups. If we look at baseball, the really successful players, not unlike our own athletes, are from more impoverished areas. Largely, Aboriginal culture is disproportionately represented as well, right? The most famous baseball players are Aborigines, were when they were defeating Japan in what, mid-70s, I want to say? 76, I think, was the big year that's on the money, for celebrating children. And so these are wonderful comparative points, and I think this ties in with Andre's point wonderfully, that put them together, what a great dialogue that becomes.
But the baseball thing also has a bearing on the question of Taiwan's identity, very
Yeah.
strong.
Yeah,
Because I remember in the 1960s, when they had these Little League baseball, the Little League championship team, Taiwan was winning them year after year.
absolutely.
And this was a major issue in terms of national pride.
Yeah, yeah.
And I remember that I was doing field work, and the whole village, this was 1964, the whole village got up at 3 o'clock in the morning to see the game with being broadcast in the States with, 12-hour difference time.
Well, and even today, when I tell South Carolina doesn't, most people don't know much about Asia, and so when I tell people there, I lived in Taiwan for 10 years, and I work on Taiwan, and the first reaction is always great beaches. They think I'm talking about Thailand, right? The second reaction, even today, is baseball.
Well, the idea.
Little League.
The issue is this, that in this context, baseball became popular at the national level because of what was happening, because of these victories and the the proud branding. It might not necessarily have been become as popular if it just remained a parking lot game. But and so in terms of Wei Chi, one doesn't see that. Your own thing to show that
Right.
it is not a significant branding game
I think
for
that's right.
Taiwan,
Yeah.
because they don't do that well in the competitions compared to Korea or China
Yeah.
or Japan.
And to some degree, Taiwan's identity in Wei Chi is either Chinese or Japanese. So you're right, as far as branding, it's absorbed into
But
its
we
success.
assume that suddenly there's some Taiwan champions appear.
Yeah,
That might change.
I think it could. I think it could. Andrew Morris has written on baseball quite wonderfully, and he talked about the pro-independence and pro-unification groups who go to American Little League games and beat each other up. They'd hire airplanes to have flyers behind. So they go Taiwan team, and then that airplane was destroyed. And so this becomes very much a part of national identity. And again, for me, this was new territory, not only because of the game itself, but it was the first time I was looking at Chinese elements of Taiwanese culture. Before that, it always been Taiwan out. And again, I think this becomes part of a very fecund conversation we have about cultures of masculinity, about Taiwan's place in East Asia, about dialogues. I think now movies, for example, are being made hoping to reach that Japanese audience and the Korean audience and the mainland audience. And you often see these movies with stars, one representative from Beijing, one from Hong Kong, one from Taiwan, as a part of a marketing to create a common East Asian identity. And Taiwan, I think, is front and center of this because it's always had this wonderful hybridity of these different elements. No, excellent point. Excellent point.
If I can follow up on the baseball point, when various players got into the major leagues, and this was about 20 years after that, particularly in the Yankees, this was important because Taiwan was desperate to show itself to the world.
Yeah.
And so in Taiwan, that's reflected by in the middle of the night, I could turn on the TV and get Yankee games
Yeah.
because a prominent Taiwanese player was betting on the Yankees.
Yeah.
They made a big splash, and it's kind of,
Well, and he decimated attendance of Taiwan games. Suddenly everybody was watching the American games. They were watching him rather than, that's
Yeah, right.
shifted back.
Yeah.
I think other questions from the group here.
There was oh yeah, please.
Just reminds me of some examples that could maybe help you to get a better understanding of your description about those people playing Weiqi on the street. Is that I remember that when I was in Beijing, you may get chances to see the different roles that a grandpa would play when he's playing Weiqi by himself and with his old friend, and when he's playing Weiqi with his grandsons.
Absolutely.
And then,
Yeah.
for example, in Beijing, maybe some of them were like intellectuals before the Cultural Revolution, but they were like kind of suffered from that and then turned out to be working class.
Yeah.
So when they were playing Weiqi with their friends, maybe in the park or somewhere else, that they used that as a method to remind themselves of being an intellectual and also their persistence of the classic Chinese culture. So maybe they could like just play one term for the whole day with a very low speed, and they do not care that much about the winning or losing because they thought that it was against the true nature hidden behind that. But when they were playing that with their grandson, who were professionally trained in school, they would, instead of criticizing them of being so ambitious or aggressive, but they would encourage them to beat their grandpa and to encourage them to get more involved, like a young generation who could have the courage to face fierce competition for today. So I think that would be a kind of example to show how the grandpa is trying to play different roles.
No,
My question is about, I remember that you mentioned that you conducted interviews to some kids.
Yeah.
And did you ask about their motivation of taking part in the training?
Yeah.
Either them or their parents?
Yeah, that's
What made them choose to?
good. Well, first let me respond to your statement as well as your question, because I think it's really interesting. Actually, no, the park players, they were fast players. I never saw a game last more than a half an hour. Now, that wasn't true in the 80s, for example, when they were playing in big stadiums. But I never saw a game that lasted a long time. I agree, though, that it's a wonderful, looking at the way this becomes a training of generations. But I would suggest that is embedded in.
I think at least some.
No, I think, I mean, we could agree to disagree. I've never seen it. I've never seen that. But that doesn't discount your point that the ways that grandparents can interact with their children, and they have a hard time talking to each other. It's from such different generations. And I think Weiqi is one way that they can communicate very wonderfully. So that's an important point. And then, Oh, what do they play? Almost all of them were there because their father specifically wanted them to play. The girls especially almost always had a father who was truly passionate about the game. And then the final thing, it would always be, well, it's either this or tennis, or it's either this or piano, or it's either this. So it wasn't that they would either play weiqi or have free time, but it was they would either play weiqi or do something else that was equally grueling in nature. All great points, though. Thank you. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Professor, thank you for your presentation. In your slides, you talk about a go.
Yeah.
And a go as the symbol of popular culture. And I'm just wondering if you have any specific methods or conclusions in your research indicating that go may be a representative aspect of popular culture in general. For example, other territories of popular culture like media and recreation, food, or commercial or technology.
Yeah.
And I think maybe for scholars of East Asia, is it possible or fair to critique that? It may be easy for us to talk about the region at large in terms of the similarities and mutual influences. But are we neglectful of the local and distinct developments, and could we be sloppy or too casual in terms of linking the similarities and disregarding the individuality and distinctness of each of the cultures in the region?
These are all valid points. Okay, what venues does it come up in? You see it in commercials. You see it on book covers for commerce and government. The picture of a weiqi board has taken the imagination as intellectual prowess and as a battle. So in Taiwan, I saw books, if you go to Chongping Shudian, right, a sleep bookstore, and if you want to look at a book on political science, chances are one of those political science books will have a picture of weiqi on the cover with countries. If you look at economics, I saw this book cover, and on the pieces they had described commerce and investment and risk and these kinds of things. And then to some degree it's used as an elite marker of status in the same way as chess might. Here, if you see a chess board in a commercial, chances are it's for a very expensive product. So these are the ways. As for, I forget the exact language, carelessness I think was the general theme. And that's a fair point. To what degree do we need to talk about distinctive elements of particularly Taiwanese culture? To what degree does a club teaching people of mainland and club teaching people in Taiwan differ? Is it fair to treat them the same? And I think normally I'd agree with you. Normally I would say it's very important we make distinctions. So Taiwanese pop music and mainland pop music are a world of difference, and I talk about that in very detailed form. Religious practice, very much starting in Taiwan, but becoming a different animal in China because of the government interference. I think with weiqi, though, it's a point of shared culture, and I'm not sure we should dismiss it as saying if it's shared, it's not Taiwanese. In the same way that I would argue McDonald's is Taiwanese. Whereas a lot of scholars will say, no, that's Western, it's American, it's not Taiwanese. Starbucks. If you go in, there's a whole lot of people speaking Chinese with Taiwanese accents in Starbucks in Taipei, right? It's home. I remember a friend of mine's child, came to America for the first time and he was homesick. And the parents said, okay, well, let's go for some food. He said, yeah, let's go for McDonald's. I'm really homesick. So I would argue the same thing for weiqi, that we want to look at the particulars of time and place, but to some degree we also need to look at the shared meeting point of this, and I think this is not overly popular in Taiwan studies. And it may be a flaw that I'm very much guilty of, that assuming if it's got Chinese markers, it's not Taiwanese. That would be my answer. Sure.
And sort of in addition to that, I think one of the things they study popular religion is in fact Taiwanese popular religion helped recreate
Exactly.
popular religion in the mainland. I
Yeah.
mean, that's certainly the Taiwan Fujian case,
Yeah.
which I saw firsthand.
Yeah.
For those early years, I think that had a dramatic effect on a reinvigoration of something that was being killed by the state.
Well, a lot of people don't remember. So they're looking to Taiwanese tracts that have been printed up at temples, left at temples. They're looking at Taiwanese investment. So there's a wonderful reverse flow, if you want to call it that Taiwan is retaking the mainland. I've heard that a lot with pop music as well. And I think there's a lot of truth to
Any other?
that. This gentleman, you had your hand up for a while, in the blue shirt.
I don't know if you're familiar with Singapore, but would you consider it part of the East Asia popular culture, or would you consider it more like Southeast Asia?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, I've only been to Singapore once, but I was so struck at how it reminded me of America in the 1950s when you looked at ethnic. I was at a hotel and everyone working at that was a Malay, and everyone staying there was Taiwanese or Chinese. I think if we look at popular culture, we should very much see it as, maybe it's a geometry exercise, that they're overlapping circles. So there are parts of mainland Malay culture, the accent, the English accent being very distinctive. But so much of the music, for example, I interviewed, do you know Sun Yinzi? I interviewed her once and I called her a Taiwanese performer and she got so mad at me. I was like, okay, I didn't mean that. And she said, I'm happy that Taiwan listeners appreciate my music, but I want to emphasize I'm from Singapore. And what I did not say is, yes, but your label is Rock Records from Taipei, and your sales are from Taipei, and your language that you're using when you say, I didn't argue with her about it. But I guess, again, those overlapping circles, I think.
Well, it's interesting that question was brought up because maybe a month ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, we had a talk here, not in this context, but in Democratic University, on funerals in Singapore, Chinese funerals in Singapore. And the whole talk dealt with how they could modernize and change, and the sense you got these were internal development. I asked, what are these funerals called? Oh, they're called Taiwan style funerals. So obviously there is
Tremendous.
there's a lot of flow all over the place here in all sorts of directions. And of course, I like your point very much that Taiwan is sort of floating with the other vessels, if you will, in this sea and with overlapping cultural forces.
Can I steal that? I'm just going to write that.
But having said that,
Yeah.
there are certain things that as the seminar progresses, there are certain things that are being focused on in Taiwan, which are exactly being focused on precisely because they don't quite fit into that pattern.
Yeah.
And such as the Aboriginal heritage, which is
Right.
now becoming a big thing,
Yeah.
right? The Austronesian heritage.
Yeah.
These annual conference in Taiwan on Austronesian language, and
Yeah.
Taiwan is the center of that. And there are other things that are related to this as well. So I think that one of the fascinating things about Taiwan is that some of the foci represent almost in a negative way these forces that we're talking
Well,
about.
and the other thing is they take on larger than life personas. As you know, my wife is Aboriginal from Taiwan, and I should have done a pop music thing because I keep bringing it up, but I was so struck when I was doing the pop music that every book you look at in Chinese language in Taiwan has a chapter on Aboriginal music. How many of us are really listening to this music on a day-to-day basis? How much does it really influence Chinese pop music other than images like Ame wearing leopard skin dresses and things? And so I guess this ties into my earlier point that we cannot ignore China as much as our impulse is to do that, because it does Taiwan a disservice, I think. And at the same level, things like Aborigines, Taiwan baseball are promoted both primarily, I would argue, by the government as ways of saying we are not Chinese. And so I think baseball may be not a fair example because it's so popular, but to some degree, we in Taiwan, I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but I'll say it, we in Taiwan maybe are making our own distortions in really focusing on elements like Aborigine culture, which most of my friends who are not Aborigine really haven't been influenced by this at all. I mean, it's so distorted by the mass media that it's questionable whether there's any Aboriginal element to it to begin with.
That's what's interesting about it.
It is.
Because if you're talking about all these interconnections and similarities and shared life, the fact that people are focusing on this thing
Exactly.
is part of the broader picture.
Well, and if you look at academia Seneca, it's for a long time it was religion or Aborigine studies. That was it. And now I think they're branching out to psychology and to this in marriages and these other things. But obviously, I'm not saying these are unimportant issues. These are vitally important to Taiwan studies. But to some degree, we're distorting this as well. I think. Excellent point.
Anybody else? Anybody else? I'll throw in one more.
Okay.
I think the other point, academia Seneca, it was only after 1979 that the Taiwan studies could be studied as Taiwan studies.
Yeah.
I mean, it was China, 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 China. All of a sudden now Taiwan comes into its own, and there can be a new literature. It's always there, but somehow not hidden. And now at least there's your institute and other.
Yeah.
Well, Taiwan studies was not actually set up until 1993.
Yeah, I know.
Before that
Right,
was KA.
yeah, well, that's why I put it in that term. Yeah,
But
right.
it was kind of dominated.
Yeah, right. But up to that point, from the American standpoint, also Taiwan was still China until '79. And even Taiwan, as I remember, you have other institutes studying Taiwan, but without necessarily calling themselves Taiwan studies. And, in a formal way, yeah.
And the amount that, I didn't mean to dismiss music school. They've done amazing work. And as you're pointing out, Marc, I think that they were able to create a whole new field that had been ignored. So, yeah, no, I agree. Yeah.
I just thought about the correlation between Wei Qi and the youngsters' test scores,
Yeah.
and why their parents so aggressively push it. Somehow, if their kids are good at Wei Qi or Xiang Qi, they are automatically smart.
Well, the math scores tend to be much higher. No, absolutely. And the other thing is, and I don't know this in Taiwan, you guys can tell me, in China, if you're very good at anything, that lowers the test score you need to get in. Kind of like Americans, we have a different standard for athletes that we admit. So, for example, I heard rumor of a professional Wei Qi player, not rumor, I know a professional Wei Qi player who got into Beidao without ever taking the Liankao. And most of the professional players had points added to their Liankao points. Now that's true if you're a good pianist or a tennis player or any of this other stuff. But beyond just being smart, there's actual practical reason. Not unlike in America now, if you're head of the yearbook album committee, it helps you tip the scale in a competitive age where everybody's got straight A's. So, yeah, no, it's a good point.
And also, are the chess playing, like mostly for male kids?
Yeah.
You know, is there an element that deliberately keeps, the parents would keep girls deliberately
Good.
out of this so that they won't be competitive?
Yeah, you know, I was struck, you know, being a chess player, at a young age, when they first start, 4 or 5 years old, 6 years old, they're roughly the same amount of girls as boys. And that's unlike chess, which is very male dominated from the very beginning. And I think what happens is there are all these very, by American standards, very problematic discourses about natural ability and logic and aggression. And to me, what was striking about this is often the females would say this themselves. So the professional female player who's better than 99.999% of the world would also say men are just better at logic. And there wasn't a questioning of the way that this was completely constructed by societal expectations, parental expectations. To my knowledge, every professional female player has a father who is near professional or professional level. So like many professions, the woman just has to be better to get to the same spot, I think. And has to overcome a tremendous amount of cultural stereotypes and cultural encouragement and discouragement that trains them to go certain directions at certain ages. I think this is going to change. China, for example, they only allow 20 professionals a year out of 1.3 billion. 2 or 3 of them have to be female, I forget the number. So it's not a lot, but they're making sure that even if the women cannot beat the men, they're represented in some way. So I think the next generation will have role models like the Taiwanese team. These female role models, I think, will change the face of Wei Qi. And I would predict, just like now law is over 50% female in America or other places. In America, university students, almost over 50%, graduate students over 50%, law, medicine, all female dominated. And so what it's going to do to American culture is very exciting, I think. In Taiwan and China, I think the patriarchy is still a little bit more entrenched, but I think women are having more opportunities, and this is going to change. And the stereotypes change after the job. So people do a good job at the job, and then, so I think the next generation, either your generation or your children's generation, these things are going to be changing. Good, excellent point, though.
Okay, well, the time is here, and once again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming on such a beautiful sunny day. I still appreciate that.